You find yourself standing in the shadows of a grand cathedral on a crisp morning in Tudor England. The year is 1533, and sunlight streams through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across cold stone floors. The air is thick with incense and the whispered prayers of nobles gathered for what should be the most joyous day in a young woman's life. But if you look closely at the bride standing before the altar, you'll notice something that chills you to the bone. Her hands are trembling, not with excitement, but with pure terror. This is Anne Boleyn, and she's not walking into a fairy tale. The man beside her, King Henry VIII of England, is decades older and holds absolute power over her life. She has waited years for this moment, but the reality is far more terrifying than the dream. Her childhood ended the moment her family pushed her into the king's path. And now she stands here, knowing that in a few hours, she will face something that fills her with more dread than any battlefield or plague: her wedding night. This isn't the sanitized fairy tale of movies or romantic dramas. This is the brutal reality of Tudor royal marriages, where women were bound to men for political power, where the most intimate moments of a queen's life became public property, and where wedding nights weren't celebrations of love, but traumatic initiation rituals that could destroy you. Welcome to the true story of why Tudor queens feared their wedding nights more than death itself. These aren't just tales of nervous brides getting cold feet. These are stories of systematic terror, of women forced into roles they couldn't escape, of queens who understood that their wedding night might be the last night they ever felt safe. The first thing you need to understand about Tudor royal marriages is that they had absolutely nothing to do with love. These weren't romantic unions between willing partners. They were business transactions, political alliances, and breeding arrangements where the bride's feelings were not just irrelevant, but actively dangerous to the families involved. Picture this reality. You're a noble daughter, perhaps barely in your teens, learning music or embroidery, when your father summons you to his chambers. He doesn't ask for your opinion or seek your consent. He simply informs you that you've been promised to a man you cannot refuse. Your childhood is officially over, and there's nothing you can do about it. Anne Boleyn, like Catherine Howard after her, learned this cruel truth. Their value wasn't measured in their intelligence, kindness, or dreams for the future. Their value was measured in the alliances their marriages could secure, and most importantly, the heirs they could produce. The psychological impact of this system cannot be overstated. Tudor queens grew up knowing their bodies didn't belong to them, that their futures were decided by men in palaces, and that someday they would be handed over to a king who held absolute power over their lives.
But the arranged marriage was just the beginning of the nightmare. The real horror started with something called the bedding ceremony, a Tudor tradition so invasive and traumatic that it would be considered torture by modern standards. This wasn't a private moment between newlyweds. This was a public spectacle where the most intimate act of marriage became community entertainment. After the wedding feast, the bride and groom would be escorted to their bedchamber by crowds of wedding guests. Family members, friends, nobles, and sometimes complete strangers would pack into the room, making crude jokes while the terrified couple was forced to undress. For Tudor royals, the bedding ceremony was even more invasive. Because these marriages were political alliances worth kingdoms, there had to be witnesses to ensure consummation. In some cases, guests would actually remain in the room during the sexual act itself. The bride's virginity, her fear, her tears, all of it became public property. Imagine being Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard, already terrified of the king you've been forced to marry, and then having dozens of adults watch as you're stripped naked and prepared for what you know will be a painful and frightening experience. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Tudor wedding nights wasn't the public humiliation. It was the youth and vulnerability of the brides themselves. Catherine Howard, barely in her late teens, was pressured into marriage with Henry VIII, a man in his late 40s, obese, and terrifyingly powerful. Anne Boleyn herself, though older, entered marriage under immense fear, knowing the king had already discarded one wife and could just as easily destroy her. The political value of Tudor queens was so high that families couldn't afford to wait until women were emotionally or physically ready. The medical reality made this even more horrifying. Without modern medicine, childbirth was a gamble with death. Tudor queens were expected to risk their lives repeatedly for heirs. Anne Boleyn herself endured this pressure. After her marriage in 1533, the expectation was immediate: produce a son. She became pregnant quickly, but when her first child was a girl, Elizabeth, the disappointment was immense. Every subsequent pregnancy carried life or death stakes. These queens faced their wedding nights knowing that they might be forced into pregnancies their bodies couldn't survive, and that failure meant disgrace or even death. The wedding night was just the beginning of a lifetime of systematic oppression. Every dawn brought new reasons to fear what lay ahead. After that first traumatic night, queens like Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard would find their bodies inspected, their bed sheets examined, their fertility monitored by physicians and courtiers. The pressure to conceive was crushing. Anne Boleyn's repeated miscarriages became public scandals. Her inability to give Henry a son sealed her fate. The medical reality of Tudor pregnancy made these fears even more rational. Childbirth was essentially a death sentence that some women survived. Henry VIII's wives lived with this terror daily. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth wife, risked her life when she became pregnant late in the king's reign. She survived childbirth, but many queens did not. Perhaps the most crushing aspect was the isolation. These queens were cut off from family, trapped in palaces where every word and movement was monitored, and surrounded by enemies. Anne Boleyn, accused of treason and adultery, was abandoned by almost everyone at court. Her letters revealed despair, homesickness, and terror of what lay ahead. The most tragic cases were queens who simply broke under the weight of fear. Catherine Howard became reckless, desperate for affection, and ultimately lost her life to the executioner's axe. The wedding night fears of Tudor queens weren't just about one night. They were about a lifetime of knowing their survival depended on a king's desire, on childbirth, on politics they couldn't control. The next time you see a Tudor wedding portrayed in film or television, remember Anne Boleyn, trembling as she realized her fate. Remember Catherine Howard, barely more than a child, sent to Henry's bed. Remember Catherine Parr, risking her life in childbirth. Behind every crown was a frightened woman sold into a system that valued her only for what her body could produce. These Tudor queens deserve to be remembered not just as political figures or historical footnotes, but as human beings who endured unimaginable trauma with a strength that should inspire us all.